do business with people they like. And so building those relationships and building a community feel where people feel, hey, I need some help.
Nothing beats getting in the room together and just throwing stuff up on a whiteboard and seeing what sticks and what slowly slides off as you investigate it further.
It's one thing to be able to say, hey, we know what the issues are. It's something entirely different to be able to say, and here's what the really smart CEOs are doing about it.
One of the biggest discussions that I've heard over the last couple of years is certainly about the impact of AI in business. And today we're going to talk about the impact of AI in law on the mind behind. And we have got someone who is more than qualified to discuss that with us. That is Ted Miller. Why is Ted qualified? Just to give a little bit of a background of Ted. He was born in Glasgow, my home country, in 1962, but emigrated to Australia just at the age of 2. I'm going to guess he had a bit of help to do that. He qualified out of the University of Sydney with a Bachelor of Laws and Bachelor of Economics with political science, lectured at the University of Sydney on political science and the University of Newcastle in law. He was a barrister in Sydney from 2002 to 2009 and general counsel up until 2015. Big background. He's happily married to Jenny. He's also an author. 3 books. 3 very different books. Shoot and Demonize: The Death of Ronnie Levy in 2000. Getting into Law in 2002. And The Priests, which was about 2015, 2016. He's currently writing The Catholic Moment: Ideas, Power, and the Catholic Resurgence in the West. So you begin to get a bit of background now that Ted just doesn't kind of specialize in one area. I've known Ted for a couple of years, and we've had several good discussions off air about this. So it was really good to get him on here. He shares his background as a lecturer, a lawyer, and author, and discusses what he sees is AI's impact, not just in law, but on society and culture, and just about how we're maybe approaching it. And definitely around its limitations and potential biases. The conversation, we're delving into what it's got, the implications it's got for the legal profession, how it can be used, and how it's maybe a bit of a danger, the current applications, and what he sees as the future developments. Ted emphasizes during this the importance of the human expertise in law. We're not going to get away from that, but how AI can really integrate and supplement that. And listen out for his challenge at the end with a magnificent Shakespearean twist. But let's dig into this. Let's hear what Ted has to say about AI in law. I'm absolutely delighted that you've been able to join us today, Ted. Good to see you.
Nice to be here, Graham. Good to be with you.
Ted, just before we kind of get into the main part of the conversation, I know we're going to talk about AI in law and legal practices and kind of the implications of it. What's your background?
Born in the same city that you were born in fact, Glasgow. Migrated to Australia at a very young age with my wonderful parents. University of Sydney Law and Political Science. First job was lecturing political science at the University of Sydney. Then lectured in law schools for a decade, wrote a major book about the Australian legal system. Practiced at the Sydney Bar for 8 years, up to and including appeal in the High Court. So had an opportunity to do most things. Then spent a number of years as corporate counsel and went into retirement in 2018. I'm currently working on a new manuscript for a new book. I've got 3 published books so far with commercial publishers, and happily retired and happily beavering away on a new manuscript.
What's the books?
The first book was about a celebrated police shooting here in Sydney. A man called Ronnie Levy was shot on Bondi Beach in the late 1990s. I attended the inquest along with counsel for his widow and had access to the police record, which was extensive. Wrote a book about that called Shoot and Demonize: The Death of Ronnie Levy. Came out in the year 2000. Followed that up in 2002 with a major book which came out of my intro law lectures, which I delivered at universities for about 8 years. The book is called Getting into Law. It's still used in some university law schools published by LexisNexis. And the final book came out in 2016. It's actually a memoir called The Priests. People can read it if they want. It's a bit of a difficult topic. I was caught up in the bad behaviour of certain members of Catholic clergy when I was a teenager at high school. And it had a bad effect on me later on in life. And part of dealing with the mental health issues that it gave rise to was to set it all out in a memoir, actually with the assistance of a psychiatrist. And it was a very difficult period, but I had some fantastic medical assistance and took a few years, but managed to recover my mental health. And that book was a very important part of it, in the sense of having it. It was written, it was well received, it sold very well, but in my mind, there's the book, there's the past, it's on the shelf, let's move on. So that was how it was helpful to me.
It's interesting how psychologically we can do different things that can actually begin to park it.
Absolutely, yeah. And it requires a lot of work, particularly if you've got a serious problem. So you have to take it seriously. But if you find a good counsellor or a good psychiatrist, you will find, and I'll just say this as a general remark, that they will give you takeaways, that is, things that you need to do as a mental routine in order to rebuild or to get things parked, as you quite appropriately put it. But that was a difficult period, but I'll look back on it now with real gratitude for the help that I got, and also quite proud of myself being able to dig myself out of that hole and move on. So, yeah.
So you should be like Ted. I know that we spent a bit of time offline, and every time that we have a discussion, we always go in depth about something, whether it's a walk or a beer.
Yeah. After a walk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious. What's your interest in having retired? What's your interest in AI within law?
I do keep up with the technology generally, and I find the whole artificial intelligence domain very, very interesting. I could say a few things about it, but I'll just make one point about it. The election of Donald Trump, love him, hate him, whatever, but along with that, you've seen a huge effort in the US to try and take control of AI and how it will be developed. I agree with the proposition that it is going to have a huge impact on our culture generally moving forward. There's a lot of hype about it, but it is going to have a huge impact. And these generative AI models, if they're not built properly in terms of their foundations, in terms of the values that are built into them, then they will skew the culture in ways that we might not want to happen. So, for example, the deep seek that came out of China has been banned in a lot of jurisdictions. And one of the reasons for that would be, for example, that you would think there's little doubt that fundamental concepts like freedom, democracy, etc., there's going to be some skewing in the algorithm that would be operating DeepSeek. And also there might be backdoors into those programs where influence can be had through those systems by, let's call them people that want to influence Western culture in ways that we might not want to influence. So it's a very, very big issue for the culture, for politics, and for our Western way of life. I really do think it is going to be that significant. You'll see that unfold over the next 20 odd years. So I've taken a bit of an interest in it. I want to know how it works, and I want to know what the impact of it might well be, and keep a bit of an eye on it.
It's interesting, skewing. Is it not naturally? I remember when ChatGPT first came out, when we were speaking about that, and I remember there was the talk about, oh, it doesn't give us anything after 2021. It must be rubbish. But obviously it was learning very, very quickly. It's gone beyond that. But it's only as good as kind of the information that it's learning or is being pointed to, or information that's coming in. So they're not all inherently biased at times.
No, they're not all inherently biased. But there's two things that are at play here. Firstly, they're all a bit of a black box. So if you look at the mathematics behind them, I watched a wonderful lecture given just a week or so ago by Terence Tao, who is currently, in the minds of many people, the greatest living mathematician. He's a child prodigy, actually born in Adelaide in South Australia. And he was giving a presentation on generative AI. He likened it to a guessing machine, and he talked about the maths that's embedded in it in order to construct the algorithms. It's linear algebra, it's calculus, it's probability, it's statistics. But there is a lot of scope in the building of those algorithms to skew the way the learning part of how you get the system up and get it useful can be manipulated.
Yeah.
I'll use the word program. And there's also, just as we speak about it now, there's quite a lot of literature about how certain of these applications appear, unfortunately, to already have a racial bias in them, so on and so forth. So there's plenty of scope for that. And if the foundations are not, as it were, let me put it this way, if they don't encapsulate norms about free and open discussion on important ideas, fundamental ideas such as truth and freedom and democracy and liberty, and we could add other important concepts to that from a Western liberal democratic point of view, then downstream users who are unaware of these foundational debates just take the output of generative AI and with the legitimacy, the apparent legitimacy it has, and perhaps place a little bit too much faith, trust, and value in it. So we've got to be careful with that. And as I mentioned before, this is a big part of what's happening in the US at the moment. They're looking at spending nearly $1 trillion to establish not only the data centers, but everything else that's necessary in order to, as it were, be the world leading AI producer, provider, and to have these sorts of safeguards included in it. Of course, we've got to keep a close eye on the tech bros. You never quite know what the tech bros are up to. I think they're largely trustworthy. You do see, for example, I'll use the election of Donald Trump. The tech bros tend to go wherever democracy goes. So Mark Zuckerberg has changed his tune on a number of things after the election of Mr. Trump and so on and so forth. So I think largely you can trust the Silicon Valley guys to embody those values, those important values, and to do hopefully what's necessary to make sure that this very important new technology is consonant with fundamental values of the West and liberal democracy. And I don't want to sound like I'm mouthing too many cliches, but I think these civilizational values are very, very important.
It's interesting because they can almost the old technology, your Facebooks and Amazons and everything, they've come under kind of a lot of scrutiny just about how they use information, how much they're listening to us, and that's been going on for 10 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, you believe that they're fundamentally kind of doing it for good?
Well, they're doing it to make a buck.
Yeah.
Firstly, but secondly, I do think that Facebook, for example, and if you look at Twitter, I mean, it changed ownership from the previous owners, now X under Mr. Musk, and that was done obviously with an ideological agenda. There's no question about that whatsoever. Facebook has removed its so-called moderation, and others will call it censorship, after the election of Mr. Trump. So they're quite capable of moving with the times, and they're all aware that at the end of the day, let's take again the United States as an example, the US Congress passed legislation dismantling the monopolies in the 1920s, the antitrust legislation. And the power of a law passed through the Congress, if the American Congress believes that these large technology companies are traducing fundamental values that have to be protected, is not to be underestimated. So I think it's good that we keep a close eye on them, but generally I think what's happening with these big technology companies is consistent with fundamental Western values, and but that also requires vigilance all the way through. And our legislatures, our lawmakers, our media, our commentators have all got a job to do there, and that's just always going to be the case in a free society.
We will kind of come back to what do we think the lawmakers should be doing, kind of what we need to. But you mentioned earlier that this is a black box. What did you mean by that? Just to explain that to some of the listeners.
Sure. Well, the way, let me put it this way. there are two types of language being used in these large language models. There is the formal language of mathematics, creates the algorithms, and allows questions to be computed and to come up with an answer at the end of the day. That's what an algorithm does generally. But they're also reading lines of natural human language and coding them so it can then be manipulated through these algorithms to come up with a guess about what the next word should be. The complexity of the maths, and with all respect to Terence Tao, the absolute genius that he is, he says it's fairly mundane maths, but I take that to mean that you need a PhD to even begin to get below the surface. So it's a black box in that sense. It's also my suspicion that even in the large tech companies, there's probably very few people in those companies who could tell you how the entire chat GPT system, just to pick one of these models, for example, works. It's a bit like a 747 jumbo jet. It's got millions of parts in it. Nobody can tell you exactly how the whole thing works, but they have the technology, they have the engineering, they put it together and it flies quite reliably. So in that sense, it's a black box. But there's two fundamental limits here. One is to do with natural human languages. And I'm just going to refer back to Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, who wrote the Tractatus, I think it's 1922. And in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein established that human languages, at some point, they run out of meaning. You just can't use them to get to any further level of truth. So there is a fundamental limitation to what human languages can do. But the point is, we don't know quite where that is. So we don't know when we've quite run out of meaning. For example, if you read Immanuel Kant's famous book, The Critique of Pure Reason, to this day, people don't know what he actually meant when you get right down to the really, really hard part of that book. And one of the reasons is probably that the language he's using just ran out of the ability to take the thought any deeper. And then when you turn to maths, I mean, Kurt Gödel, his incompleteness theorem, not long after Wittgenstein gave us the Tractatus, tells us that any system of maths, again, will have truths in it that you simply can't deduce from the axioms. So there's an incompleteness in all mathematics. Therefore, there's an incompleteness in all computability. It runs out at some point. And again, that point's hard to define. The simple way to illustrate it is with the famous lies paradox. This sentence is false. So if the sentence is false, it's true. If the sentence is true, it's false. In other words, the proposition contained in that paradoxical sentence is undecidable. And so there is this fundamental limitation in language, natural language, and mathematics considered as a technical language, which means that these systems will, as it were, get to a point where what they're looking at cannot be computed and is literally undecidable. And where that actually happens and at which point that point of being undecidable occurs is unknown. It's mysterious. So there's the black box element there in a number of layers. And this gives rise to a fundamental problem with all these systems, and that is that they will hallucinate. So they will come up with answers to a question which is completely false, has no relationship to reality whatsoever, because the algorithms have a function and it says, here's the task we've been given, we must complete it. So they will give you an answer at the end of the day, but the answer is just a complete hallucination. It's completely false. And this, because of some of the reasons that I've just given, is an inherent feature in these systems. So it is a black box in the sense that you and I wouldn't be able to look into it and figure out how it actually works, like deliberations in a jury room, for example, is a black box. And it will, and it does have this inherent tendency to produce results that it very, very confidently tells you are true, but are completely false. And this is very important from the point of view of the legal profession and AI, generative AI for lawyers. It's become a huge issue, absolutely enormous issue.
That takes us actually ideally into looking at it in the legal profession. I've been doing a bit of reading on AI hallucination and didn't realise how wide it was. There's one famous case, we spoke about it a couple of weeks ago. There's one famous case, Mata and Avianca. You want to just give us a little bit of background to that one?
Well, Avianca is the flagship airline of Latin America. It's out of Colombia. It's actually the flagship carrier for the country of Colombia. Its hub is in Bogota. And Mr. Matar was on a flight from Bogota into JFK in New York. And it wasn't much of an incident. It was the food trolley that banged him in the knee and he wanted to make a personal injuries claim. It was stuffed up in the courts. They end up in the district court, Southern District of New York. And the problem then is the airline says, you're out of time, statute of limitations. Your claim cannot proceed. So it's a technical issue. So Mr. Matar's lawyers used ChatGPT and filed a 10-page legal submission arguing against this technical bar of the proceedings. There are 8 cases cited from other US courts with full citations. Martinez and Delta Airlines, for example, is one of them. It's got a full citation, the name of the judge, even a transcript of the apparent reasoning from the court. All 8 of these cases are completely fictitious. They never existed. They never happened. And the lawyers who used ChatGPT to create these submissions, they asked the system, are these real cases? And the system said, yes, they come from reputable legal databases. What was actually, it seems, meant by that was that, like Dr. Frankenstein going around the cemeteries and the morgues to find body parts to stitch together into the creature and the monster, ChatGPT had been hunting around in the LexisNexis database and other legal databases and just pulling a case name from here and an idea from there and assembling these completely fictitious cases. Obviously very embarrassing for the lawyers because when the judge looked at it in the New York District Court, it became apparent very, very quickly the whole thing was just fictitious. From a lawyer's point of view, every practitioner has a very strict duty to not mislead the court about anything. And this whole thing was a complete fabrication. This has now reverberated around the entire legal world. Every jurisdiction, American Bar Association, every court in the US, the UK, and including all of the Australian courts have now jumped on this and have regulated it very, very strictly. And in New South Wales, for example, in February this year, I think it was the 3rd of February, the new law term started for 2025. The New South Wales Supreme Court, which is the Superior Court here in New South Wales, issued a generative AI practice note, which very heavily regulates it, but also guidelines for judges using AI as well, so fair enough. And also changes to the law here, so statutory changes as well. Without going through the detail, I'll give you one example. You cannot use generative AI to create an affidavit to be filed in court proceedings. That's completely out, completely ruled out. Indeed, if you're filing an affidavit now in New South Wales court proceedings, it has to include a statement saying that generative AI has not been used in the creation of this affidavit. So this has reverberated, the Matar decision has reverberated all around the world and has caused all superior courts, legislatures, professional bodies to regulate it very, very heavily indeed.
And maybe an interesting part, I was doing a bit of research yesterday and I was on ChatGPT. So I thought, I actually didn't know where they'd got their information from. So I asked ChatGPT, did you give the wrong information? And it said yes.
Yeah.
Got into a bit of a discussion about why should I trust anything that you say. And it was interesting that it kind of came up and said there was no disclaimer. So why shouldn't you be held responsible then? And said there were no disclaimers at that time. There are now disclaimers within the system, and the system's learned from it. But it was a very interesting conversation, how it kind of, as much as an interesting conversation you can have with something like GAI, of why should I trust what you say now? What safeguards have you got in place? But I was quite interested that it admitted it right away.
And I like that. There is a frankness in it. I've been on and tested it in a number of areas from a legal point of view, and it does give some quite good responses. For example, if you ask it what are the elements of a simple contract as a matter of law, it'll spit all that out quite quickly and quite efficiently, and it's pretty accurate. I'm not quite sure how useful that would be to a practicing lawyer, but it is quite frank about the limits that it has and It will tell you that this is jurisdictionally contingent, et cetera, et cetera. So the frankness of it is a good thing, and it has to be there for sure. And it's good to see, and no doubt ChatGPT, like everyone else, has learned from the case of Mr. Mittal and Avianca. If it's going to happen anywhere, Graham, it's going to happen in New York. I'm telling you.
Well, you know, I took a note of that. The Southern District of New York, what happens there is just incredible.
Yeah.
What a place.
It goes around the world in the blink of an eye.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So where is it useful in law? Where can it be used?
It will be. Can I answer that question just by stepping back a little bit? And let's use the Australian legal profession as, let's say, the marketplace. Yeah?
Yep.
So my numbers are a few years old, but the proportions are going to be the same. So there's about 100,000 solicitors in Australia, about 6,500 barristers. Now, of the solicitors, about 80% of them work in very small firms. So either sole practitioners, which are around about 80% of all firms. So one solicitor working on their own.
Yeah.
Or maybe two or maybe four. The big firms, and so medium to large firms, are only 1% of all the legal firms, but they have 20% of all the lawyers. And I think there's a real difference here between how useful these systems will be. With that background in mind, I think for the sole practitioners, I think this generative AI could be very useful doing basic legal research, which they're just not going to have the time to do themselves, so they can service their clients, as it were, face to face. So researching precedents, for example, pulling up examples of at least draft contracts, let's say for a haulage business, for example, or for a grain supply business, or for the purchase of a bookstore. These systems could generate draft contracts that be suitable for those sorts of circumstances, I think, quite efficiently. It's then up to the lawyer, obviously, to look at the draft and decide what to do with it and what not to do with it. So I really think that the marketplace and the real utility, the efficacy, is in those basic process tasks, call it the donkey work, if you will, of lawyering. And then the sole practitioners or the small firm practitioners can then look at it, check it, and treat the AI work as if it's been produced by a legal research assistant or a paralegal, document processing, data extraction, all that sort of stuff. So I think it could be, and it does it in the blink of an eye. So the time saving is enormous, but it also allows the practitioners to be more front-facing and deal with their clients and to do the important work. And that, I think, definitely will improve the overall level of service that they can provide. I don't have any doubt about that at all. So that's where I really see it working. But when you turn to the big firms, and I've had a bit of a think about this, there's what I'll call the paradox of the billable hours. Now, Graham, if you are if you're the senior partner in one of the big law firms, and you're taking home $3 million a year, that's not from your own billable hours. You are getting some cut from the billable hours of all the employed solicitors, And so if there are no worker bees, there's no honey, all right? So if these generative AI systems are going to reduce the number of lawyers that you could employ in your law firm, I can pretty much guarantee you that the partners of these big law firms will not be using it in that way. I'm not saying they've all read Karl Marx's Das Kapital and understand the surplus value of labour theory and all that, but they know where their money comes from. It comes from taking a cut from the billable hours from their employed solicitors. And that's how they do their work. The other thing about the big firms is they will have precedent contracts, just to use this as an example, which will go back 40, 50 years and have been stress tested through court decisions, mediations, disputes with other lawyers, etc., and they've been improved over time. So they don't need generative AI to create draft contracts for them. They pretty much know what's going on. I'll give you one other scenario for the more sophisticated firms. Let's say you're a lawyer in a sophisticated firm. You act for business A. They want to enter into a sophisticated commercial arrangement with my client, business B. You send me the draft contract. Now, at this point, I can put it into an AI system and have it read it and redline it for me, like note it up, with, let's say, 20 suggested alterations, changes, and whatever. My problem with that is if I'm not good enough to pick those issues myself,
Yeah.
and the machine then spits them out to me, how do I know whether it's a genuine point or not a genuine point?
Yeah.
And it seems to me that a sophisticated transactions lawyer is maybe better off just doing the work themselves up front. Whereas lawyers, and I don't want to use the phrase, but I can't think of another one, let's say lower down the food chain, who don't have that high level of specialist expertise within the firm,
Yep.
they could usefully use it as a brainstorming approach or as a let's get this up and running tool. And I think at that level, it'd be very, very useful. There was a study done, I don't know how they come up with the number, I didn't look at the methodology, but it said that on those sorts of tasks, that ChatGPT and a number of the other generative AI systems that are available out in the marketplace, they were doing better than 75 percentile in terms of lawyers. That's not a bad place to start, I have to say. Yeah.
And that is a start.
It definitely is a start. It's definitely a head start. But then the lawyer's got to put their own expertise on top of that. But it definitely gets you up and running. It's a bit like climbing the mountain. You get the chairlift half the way up and do the rest yourself. Terrible analogy, but I'm going to stick with it. And then other legal tasks. I won't go into too much detail because lawyering is fun to some, but terribly boring to others, such as discovery, for example, and checking documents and redactions and that sort of thing. I've seen a study which said that the generative AI systems and the other AI systems, the extractive AI systems, are accurate up to 80%. I have a bit of a problem with that because what's the remaining 20%? Is it that they haven't picked it or that they've excluded it? So, and where is that 20% spread throughout the whole bundle of documents? So do you have to go back through them all again? They'll have to improve that. I'm not quite sure how they do it. But there's still a lot of room for improvement in those sorts of areas. That said, it's part of the furniture, and AI is not going to replace lawyers, but I would think in most law firms you'll need somebody who is competent in using this technology because it definitely gives you an edge, particularly for the smaller firms, and I would think certainly for sole practitioners.
Is there a danger it could replace paralegals?
There is a danger it could replace paralegals. And if you look at the pricing in the marketplace, guess what? It's about the wages of a paralegal. Yeah, the median price, annualized, it looks roughly that. Just as if you go back to ancient times, the price of your average slave is about the price of, again, just changing the numbers, be about the price of buying a Toyota Hilux today, for example. So markets have a way of working this sort of thing out, and that's where it sits at the moment.
I'm just wondering if there's going to be a change. AI is here to stay. There's no doubt about that. Whether it works for the larger firms or not at the moment, it's going to have an influence. Will we see a slow shift in how they bill? I wonder if that might happen.
I think that's true. There was a very good book written in 2017 by Susskind, and I'll just turn up it's Richard Susskind, 2017. And I recommend this book for anybody interested in the topic. Oxford University Press. It's called Tomorrow's Lawyers. And Susskind, one of the arguments that he makes, with which I agree entirely, is that the generative AI that we're seeing now and I'll call it the souped up extractive AI, which has come along with it, and they're sort of bundled together now, will probably take about 20 years to mature in terms of how it embeds itself into legal practice. And that cleaves with what's happened with the first generation of AI coming into legal practice, which has taken about 20 years to mature.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you're filing in, say, the Supreme Court or the Federal Court here in Sydney today, you're doing it electronically. You use electronic court books. It's quite common to use laptops and tablets actually in the courtroom. Counsel will use them up at the lectern. But this has taken about 20 years to become the norm and to be introduced. All courts, all superior courts will have a thing called a rules committee. So it'll be chaired by the Chief Justice and there'll be a number of senior judges on it. And they keep a very, very close eye on this sort of thing. and they will not stand in the way of technology if it can improve, because there's one thing, judges won't like me saying this, but they like to get off early on a Friday so they can have a game of golf. So anything that might cut down the amount of time they have to listen to counsel presenting to them, but also just make the whole thing more efficient, to put it more seriously, they're up for it. But I think it will take quite some time. It won't totally transform. There won't be any significant transformation in the way lawyers, particularly litigation, occurs. The category error is that a lawyer is a lawyer and an AI system is not. And lawyers, whether they're transactional lawyers or litigators, or professional responsibilities, have to sign off on things at the end of the day. And they'll have professional indemnity insurance behind them. That's why, you go to a legal practitioner with the indemnity insurance behind them. But I think there will be substantial changes, and young lawyers, the ones that are coming through now, will have to be astute to this technology and how they might be able to use it, although not be too focused upon it and take their mind off the fundamental thing they have to be, which is the best possible lawyer they can make themselves.
Mentioned 20 years.
I'm thinking 20 years.
We're being too conservative with that. Just when we see how much the technology shifted and moved just over the last kind of 18 months. And you mentioned DeepSeek.
Yeah.
It was really interesting just watching the reaction.
How quick it was.
How quick it was, and then everybody else's reaction to, oh, it's here already.
Yeah. Well, the as it were, the tipping point for all of this for the legal profession is, very recent. It's only about 2022. If you look at the studies, the surveys of firms and uptake of these technologies, and then of course we had that delightful case of Matter and Avianca, which has alerted everybody to the problems. And again, as you say, with DeepSeek, you see the urgency with which legal regulators responded around the world. Let's not forget that our legislatures, the US Congress, our own parliament here, the British Parliament, they're infested with lawyers. So there is no way the legislatures are going to do away with the legal profession, as it were. I remember I was at university in Sydney, early 80s, and we were being lectured by fundamentally some old Marxists who were telling us about the revolution and whatever, and I thought it was all a bit dry. The current Prime Minister, Mr. Albanese, was in the same class that I was in, and I remember the Professor of Political Economy, Ted Wheelwright, a lovely guy, and we were having a chat, a number of students and Ted there, and he asked me what else I was doing. I said I was doing a law degree, and he said, well, you can forget that because computers are going to take all that over in about 3 or 4 years. This is 1985. Do you remember the old IBM computers with the huge big desktop cathode ray, whatever, the television green screen, and you had to learn a program name called BASIC to get them to do it? That's right. That's where the technology was then, and Professor Wheelwright told me without any doubt there's no future for lawyers. So the replacement of lawyers theory, I think, is just hype and nonsense, but it definitely will be, I think, very, very helpful for the legal profession. Susskind makes 2 arguments in particular about this. One is the regulatory argument, and that legislatures and lawmakers are all fundamentally lawyers, so they will protect the legal profession, which is very important in a liberal democracy, because you have a separation of powers. You have a legislature, you have an executive, and you have a judiciary, and you have a rule of law. So you always need a strong, healthy, well-educated, independent bar, but also solicitors as well to protect that fundamental value. So there's that question. But the other point I would make about it is that when people argue that the consumers of legal services, so let's say, again, you're a big company and you're saying to me, managing partner of the big law firm who's been looking after your business for 30 years, I want you to reduce how much you charge us because you're going to be using AI, et cetera, et cetera. The fact of the matter is that the price that people are prepared to pay for legal services is what economists would label as price inelastic. The demand is pretty much price inelastic. If something goes wrong with your company, you don't have time to sit around trying to figure out whether the other law firm will do it better. And how are you going to make that evaluation anyway? So you're going to go back to the firm that you trust and you've got a relationship with, and then you'll leave it to us to do the job properly. And that's more or less how it happens, even right down to the level of somebody gets pulled over with alcohol and drugs in their system, and they just need to get someone to go to the local court to do a plea. Very often that is, they'll phone someone up, do you know a decent lawyer? And they'll say, yeah, Jack Hobbs does a good job, and they'll go with that. So that's the reality of the market for legal services is not like the market for potatoes and bananas. Yeah. It's really quite different.
I suppose people are buying certainty as much as anything else. They're looking for kind of lower the risk, making sure that they're getting that advice. Yeah, okay. And does that mean then with the regulatory side, the regulation coming in, just managed to get that, is it a danger that could stifle innovation within the industry?
I don't think so. So the last 20 years, when courts have gone electronic, and pretty much everything you can do in the Australian court system now is electronic, has been for well over 10 years. I think the introduction of virtual courts and making them electronic and making them online pretty much kept pace with how these technologies are being used in every other sector. I think you'll find that although the legal profession is conservative in many ways, that I would contend it should always be rule of law, black letter law, stick to the law, give your client advice about unpalatable truths if you have to, et cetera, all those sorts of fundamental values of good lawyering. You'll also find that they're quite prepared. Generally, they're quite intelligent people and they're interested in these issues. And no, I don't think it will stifle innovation at all, but it will definitely, the rules committees of the courts, the legislatures, the professional associations, the lawyers themselves will act as a very strong filter to make sure that it doesn't transform the legal profession in a way that would be unhealthy for the society more broadly. So
we're never going to find ourselves represented by AI in court.
No, and I hope it never happens. No, it's not going to happen. It's the short answer to your question. You remember that part of the black box issue with AI is it's not a truth-telling robot. It has no conception of truth at all whatsoever. That's not part of its gig. It's predicting what should come next. And very, very helpfully, I mean, some of the AI systems are extraordinary. What they're trying to do, of course, is replicate what a human mind can do. And some of them are just so fantastically good at it. You know, the AI systems that can play chess and beat grandmasters, for example. Yeah.
Yep.
But when you're talking about lawyering, and I sort of refer back to what I said about Wittgenstein and Gödel, just generally to make this point, that good lawyering, even just in a simple thing, in front of a local court magistrate, you have a client who's in a spot of bother, you've got to try and read the room, you've got to try and read the mood of the magistrate, how busy is the list and whatever, and tailor, let's say, your plea to get him out of there or get her out of there on the day. And there's a fair bit of intuition involved in that. Yeah. And no AI system can ever give you that. So no, it's not going to happen.
Not going to give us that kind of that gut instinct. It was actually interesting. Something I was about to say was something I've always been impressed with lawyers is the thinking process. Just kind of the decision-making process, how it's unemotional while taking account of emotions. So everything else that's around, but this is the letter of the law. This is what we're working with.
Yeah. Good lawyers should always have the capacity to do that. And if you go to a good law school, that's a habit of mind that they drill into you. I was at University of Sydney Law School where they flogged us basically, thankfully, because the bottom line is, if a client comes to you and says, here's my problem, they're going to give you a recitation, some sort of menu and soup of facts about things that have happened to them. They're not going to come in and say it's Section 52 of the Trade Practices Act. So as a lawyer, the more law you know, everything else being equal, the better service you can provide. And the more creative you can be about resolving their problem. It really should be about remembering always, for example, if it's litigation, the meat and gravy of the court system is to resolve a dispute. And good lawyers look at the most effective way of resolving dispute as soon as possible, quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible. And there are very, very strict practice obligations upon lawyers to do just that. So you've always got to remember that knowing as much law as you can is always going to be important. And if there are any younger lawyers looking at these systems, please don't allow it to distract you from learning as much law as you can.
Like you're catching me. You're coming in first here, Ted, because I was just about to say you brought that book out, Getting into Law in 2002. What advice would you give to lawyers now, coming into the industry, coming in training?
I would, again, I'm just going to go back on this fundamental point. As a lawyer, your fundamental role is to be an absolute expert in the law to the fullest extent possible. That's first and foremost. So if you're going to be a great doctor, if you're going to be a great specialist surgeon, for example, you need to know how every little part of the body that's relevant to heart surgery works, all the techniques, etc. And there's an awful lot to learn. But you need to make sure that you go beyond what's required of you at law school. You really need to take advantage of that period in your training because it's fundamental. That's the foundations of your entire future as a lawyer. And never give up on keeping yourself up with the law. And it can be a little bit tedious at times, but you just have to do it. It's like the athlete has to keep training.
Yep.
It's like the musician. You know, classical musicians train 4-6 hours a day, for example, in order to keep their skills up. And a lawyer, as a true professional, needs to have that sort of dedication to task. It's particularly if you're at the bar, it's a vocation more than just a job. And I don't want to come across as overstating it, but if you want to take it really seriously, if you want to be a suburban solicitor in a 1 or 2 solicitor firm, do conveyancing, these are important things. I'm not in any way deprecating that sort of work. It's vitally important. Drafting wills properly, doing property settlements, conveyances, simple things in local courts. That's a different ballgame. But if you want to get into the more elite areas of legal practice, you have to put in an elite effort. Yeah.
Final couple of questions. Something I always ask, and I mention this. Okay, let's stick on with the young lawyers.
Yeah.
What kind of traits, attributes do you think they need to have to be able to have that kind of vocational attitude to law? What do you think would be kind of stands them in really good stead? Apart from the technical skills, let's assume the technicals. What about them?
I think some young lawyers, I don't know how many, but I've seen it. They're thinking in terms of the big house that they'll get if they're a good lawyer, or the flash car that they can get a lease on, or the prestige of being a partner in a big firm. I'd forget that. If you're a good lawyer, the rewards will come, but let the rewards come naturally. Don't make that any sort of driving motivation for you. The driving motivation just has to be the best possible lawyer you can. You will be meeting people all the time who are in crisis and they really need your help.
Yeah.
And it can be pretty stressful, but you have to be the rock that guides them through it. And again, I'm talking about litigation, but I'm also talking about people that get into family law disputes. I mean, they can be very, very difficult. So it's a very important professional role. But the other thing that you have to remember as a lawyer is that if you can imagine, you're a lawyer, you're a private citizen, but you're also an officer of the local Supreme Court, and you are standing right at the intersection, of the citizenry and the legal system, And this is fundamentally important in a free society. Whether this is front of mind on a daily basis, given the work you do or not, doesn't matter. But it's fundamentally important to the rule of law and a free society that we have a competent legal profession. And every decent lawyer, no matter what work they do, makes a valuable contribution to that. So remembering that that is one of the rationales, a key rationale for your professional vocation, should help you get some satisfaction out of the effort that you put in. The rewards will come if you're good enough, but don't be too reward focused.
Final question.
Yeah.
Final question. We always kind of try to set down a challenge. One of the things that's become really a partner is incredibly well read. You can kind of pull out these
Okay.
reference points, and you. I know that you study a lot. You kind of look at a lot of things. What kind of challenge could you set as a kind of an entry point to this for someone who's thinking about learning, say, AI or AI in the law?
Yep.
What's maybe a first step that they can do that would be a little bit out there, something a little bit different?
Well, we're talking AI and things that are so modern and so new, and I'm going to go old-fashioned on this.
Go on.
I'm going to go Shakespeare. And the challenge is to grab a copy of The Merchant of Venice, go to Act 4, Scene 1, and wrote to memory the famous speech by Portia, who, if you remember the play, is dressed up as a male lawyer, Balthazar, yeah? She's pretending to be a male lawyer.
Yep.
The quality of mercy is not strained, and on it goes. It's a magnificent speech. Why am I picking this as the challenge? 3 reasons. 1, you won't learn it. It will remind you of the power of human memory, and will also put something in your mind that will stay there forever and unconsciously will feed your mind and give it a greater capacity to understand beauty and wonder and also the way the language works. So you'll be doing yourself a great service by doing that anyway, and that's a good enough reason to do it. But secondly, it's also going to remind you that AI is not creative intelligence. If you look at large language model poetry, for example, you can go on to ChatGPT and say, give me a short poem about love lost or whatever, and it will spit something out, which seems okay, but it's basically doggerel. Because and I'm not being deprecatory here, I'm just using doggerel as a technical term for simple verse, which has been used for hundreds of years. Because ChatGPT will give you the intellectually most likely next line, but you're never going to get Prufrock thinking that he should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas, because great poetry is about the next line being the intellectually surprising one. It's not about being the intellectually obvious one. And you're never going to get to a place where Alf the sacred river ran through caverns measureless demand. So it will remind you of the distinction. Learning this great speech will remind you, because it's got some great lines in it as well. Thirdly, Portia, dressed as Balthazar, yeah? And this is for the lawyers, yeah? How does she win? Because she wins the case. She protects Bassanio from having the pound of flesh taken away, yeah? She reads the document very, very carefully, and she makes the point, not long after the famous speech, she makes the point to Shylock. She says, look, you can have a pound of flesh for sure, but there's no mention of any blood in there. So unless you can remove the pound of flesh without taking any blood, you can't have it. And if you take the pound of flesh and you put it on the scales and it's even slightly over, again, you've broken the deal. So you just can't have it. Shylock caves in at that point. Now, what's the relevance of that to any practicing lawyer or young lawyer? Be the best technical lawyer you can possibly be. Read your documents carefully and make sure that you work very, very hard on that aspect of your profession, your calling.
I actually can't believe you've chosen that. I remember really clearly as a 13, 14-year-old being bored senseless.
Yeah.
Shakespeare. And the point of the pound of flesh in blood.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I was hooked.
Sticks in the mind, doesn't it?
I was hooked from that moment. To me, it was genius thinking.
Absolutely genius.
And that was the moment. It changed everything for me with Shakespeare.
And it's not going to come from generative AI.
No, absolutely not. That's love that reference.
As much as I love it, as much as I find it impressive, and I'm not trying to poo-poo it or anything like that, but it's not a human mind, and we should all be grateful for the fact that we've got wonderful literature like Shakespeare and the rest to remind us of what a wonderful thing creative human intelligence is.
I quite enjoyed school, but that was a moment. That was a moment that absolutely sticks in my mind even now of how I felt when I heard that.
Written 500 years ago.
Incredible.
Incredible.
It's been everything I hoped it would be. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I know you've got other projects on the go coming up.
I have.
Maybe we can discuss them at some point.
Maybe we can. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Take care. Speak to you
Cheers.
soon. Bye.
Bye.